All right, y'all. Mark, am I starting again?
You're starting again.
So, welcome to another episode of Breakfast with Mark and Jen.
Yeah.
This is the second time in our series of videos where you're seeing us without breakfast because we're finishing up our fast
Yes.
with our church. And so, people these days will call their pastors out. It's not like when our parents were growing up.
Right.
When our parents were growing up, my
Yeah.
mom and your mom used to say that they both had the experience where if your pastor did something that you were kind of like, why are they doing that? You just didn't ask.
Right. Out of respect.
Correct.
They don't respect you.
So
today.
my mom and your mom have had certain similar experiences, but some different ones because they come from two different cultures, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
But just as a quick example, my mom said when she was growing up, the first pastor that her family had, he told them that, women that were supposed to be following Christ couldn't wear open-toe shoes. And she said even back then it didn't make sense to her because she
Right.
just thought about, what about women in hot climates?
Yeah.
What about Jesus? He definitely would have been in sandals.
All his toes was out.
You're right. But
All
this guy
his
was
toes
like, hey.
were out.
Right. And it wasn't just Jesus and the men of his day, the women of his day. Even today in that part of the world, they're wearing sandals.
Right.
And so I said to her, well, what did you do? She was like, I just didn't wear sandals.
Yeah.
But she was like, I didn't approach him about it. But she was like, but y'all generation will look at the pastor and be like, where's the scripture for that?
Where's the scripture for
And
that?
we'll point out why it's incorrect. So what we
They
say,
want to call you out.
nobody at Link is going to be able to be like, pastor, we saw your episode during the fast and y'all were eating egg sandwiches
Yeah.
on screen.
Right. And you know what's funny is I don't know how we started talking about open-toe shoes and sandals and feet being out. We must be hungry.
Okay. Anyway, y'all,
we must be hungry.
we thought that today a great thing to dissect and to discuss
Right.
would be cultural differences in marriage and how that affects your marriage. Some of you may not know our backgrounds, but we are visibly and obviously the same race.
Correct.
And we grew up the same faith, but we still have differences that we had to navigate in our marriage because we have different cultures.
Right.
So, Mark is coming from Caribbean heritage, specifically Jamaican.
Let's go.
And I say that because
Yeah, man.
Jamaicans are very proud of who they are. And so if you're watching this and you're from the Caribbean and you're like, oh, maybe he's Trini, maybe he's, from
Trini.
Guyana, maybe he's from... So I want to specify so that all the Jamaicans can continue to big him up and be like, yes, yes.
Listen.
Come from Jamaica.
Yeah.
And then my family, I always say we're transatlantic slave trade black.
Wow.
Because we've been here.
That's a different type of black.
Yes.
That's a different type of black.
It's the type of black that's like,
Right.
we here only because we got forced out.
Wow.
And
Wow.
listen, it's no shit.
Oh, no. It is what it is.
The reality is, where Mark's ancestors got pushed to Jamaica, mine
Yeah.
got pushed here to America. So I say it in jest, but what I'm really trying to say is I'm African American because my family has been here for generations
Right.
since the slave trade. So that though brings up differences that you cannot deny. It's not a matter of, oh, I'll get along with this person simply because we're the same race or simply because we grew up in the same faith. If you have different cultures, it can be a big problem if you don't know how to embrace those differences and use them to make your marriage work. So
Right.
let's just talk about even communication styles between
Okay. All right.
Jamaicans, Black Jamaicans and Black Americans, and what you feel like are the differences, because my family's not passive.
No.
But they still have a different way of communicating than your family. So, like, what would you say are some differences you noticed when you and I were dating?
That I grew up in definitely our environment was a lot more blunt, was a lot more candid, and the volume level at which you expressed yourself was totally different.
It's the volume for me.
So we yell, but yelling is normal.
Listen, I remember
Yelling is
saying
normal.
to you one time while we were dating, why
about?
are your dad and uncle constantly yelling at people? Because I said to you, you can get your point across to me without yelling, but don't yell at me. And you were like, but Jay, they're actually not yelling. That's their normal voice. And I was like, well, they sound angry. You're like, but if you listen to the content of their conversation and the context, they're actually not upset at each other right now. They are simply talking.
Just normal. Just, that's how we talk. Very expressive.
Yeah.
Right? You put all your emotions, all of everything you've got into what you're saying. Like, it's an expressive culture.
Yeah.
And so when you bring that into an environment, or you match that with someone who's coming from an environment that's not as expressive.
Well, listen,
right?
I think black people in general
not
tend to...
as expressive, right?
Okay.
Because I think there's different levels.
Yeah.
If you're talking about a black person is naturally emotional.
Yeah.
Naturally going to be expressive and demonstrative. But there's levels to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you marry the two different cultures and how you even communicate, it actually starts to present problems in your marriage.
Yes.
Because I grew up a certain way and we communicated this way. You grew up in a different environment and you communicated that way. So now you're bringing both of those different communication styles together.
Yeah.
How do you effectively communicate as a couple when you're not used to the person talking to you like that?
The environment I come from is you don't, like I'm not a person that sugarcoats. I don't think I grew up with parents that ever sugarcoated things with me, but they didn't yell, right? Yelling was considered disrespectful.
Right.
So they didn't yell at each other. They didn't yell at me, really. I mean, they got on me. Don't get it twisted. I grew up with traditional black American parents who also believe spare the rod, spoil the child.
Right.
So that, you can read between those lines and guess what I'm saying there. But yelling was disrespectful. And also my parents were upfront with me, but I wouldn't say brutally blunt.
Yeah.
So for example, I feel like in your family, if someone says something that other people think is a really dumb idea, your dad or one of your uncles might be like, why would you do that? That's dumb to do.
That's dumb to do. And they're not calling you dumb.
They're not, but they're saying what you're thinking of is dumb.
And they just want to let you know how bad of a decision that
Whereas
was.
in my household, my parents would say, Jen, that's not a good idea. Why don't you rethink that? Because how do you think you're going to arrive at the appropriate outcome if you do that?
Yeah.
I still got the message that that's a dumb idea, but they didn't say the words, that is dumb.
Right. And they're going to say, don't you have any good sense?
Correct.
Like a Jamaican is going to say, don't you have any good sense? And they're going to say it in a way to make you feel like you have none. You have no good sense. So what happens is now when you get married and your spouse makes a decision that you feel like wasn't a smart decision, and you go to your spouse and say, do you have any sense? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you know? Then they take offense to that. And they're like, how can you even fix your mouth to say that to me? And you're like, what? I didn't say anything wrong. Two different communication styles coming together simply because you were raised in different environments.
And phrases are different.
Yeah.
So I learned early on, like if you say to a Jamaican, oh man, my leg is bothering me. And they're like, hush. They're actually trying to be like, oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
But to an American, you're like, what do you mean hush? I'm expressing to you how my leg feels.
Yeah.
So like the first time I said to a Jamaican something that I was going through and they're like, oh, hush, sis, hush. Yeah. I was like, no, I'm not going to be quiet.
Right.
And they're looking at me like, but why would you be quiet? I'm like, because you just told me to hush. Yeah. And I'm not going to be quiet because this is what I have to say. They later on were like, no, we're actually trying to console you, like, hush, it's okay. And so even the same word in a different culture means different things. Because in American culture, if somebody says something to you and you tell them to hush, that is rude. Because you're saying to them, basically, shut up. I don't want to hear this.
Yeah.
So when a black American says to you, hush, you're like, oh, okay, they trying to tell me to shut up.
Right.
But that's offensive depending on what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah, there's so many things that when you get married, they don't tell you in the manual of marriage that you're going to have to deal with your cultural differences and you're coming into the marriage and you grew up in a specific environment and your spouse grew up in a vastly different environment, and you're going to actually butt heads just because you have different cultures. You may have the same race.
Right.
But you're like, we're not even delving into totally
interracial
different
relationships yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is another level of differences that you have to navigate. But, you know, when you grow up in a Jamaican household that says you have to work hard and you have to not only work hard, but it's your job to fix and do everything. So if there's a leaky faucet, you don't call the plumber, you fix it yourself. If there's something going wrong with the water heater, you don't call the plumber, you fix it yourself. But then you may marry someone who is used to calling the plumber.
Yeah.
And now your wife says, hey, I'm going to call the plumber. You take offense to that. Like, oh, you don't think I can do it? You don't think I'm good enough of a man? You don't think I can fix? And then you start having an argument simply because there's a cultural difference.
Yeah, and I think that there's a beauty when two cultures can come together and make it work.
Correct.
Because I believe it's an example of heaven on earth.
Right.
Because heaven is going to be a plethora of different cultures that are coming together for the same cause, which is to worship God that we've been waiting to see all this time. So I think when you have in a marriage two cultures that can come together, it's like heaven on earth because it's two cultures coming together for the same purpose, which is to make this thing work and represent God's will for marriages on earth. But, you know, a lot of times navigating cultural differences really is just a conversation. You have to take assumption out of the equation.
Right.
Because the other problem with marrying someone outside of your culture is you often are coming in with biases that you don't even realize are there. So I know from experience hearing, you know, Jamaicans say things in front of someone like me who they know is coming from an American background. Americans don't work hard. Americans don't understand hard work.
They're lazy.
I've also heard Americans, Black Americans, overemphasize the racism in this country. And both of those statements have been hurtful to me in the past. But I had to realize that a lot of times those statements really are just coming out of ignorance, and it's a conversation. But I say all that to say, you don't realize the biases that you're coming in with from another culture, right? Because then an American could say, oh, you're Jamaican and you only have 2 jobs. I thought you guys worked 10. And a Jamaican might be like, well, that's offensive. Not all of us work 10 jobs.
Right.
But it's that bias that you didn't even realize was there. And I think when you have a conversation with your spouse and understand, hey, I realize some of the biases I grew up with aren't necessarily true. Like all Americans, all Black Americans actually aren't lazy. There's a ton of hardworking Black Americans. Yeah. There's a ton of Black Americans who don't overemphasize the racial issue in this country. It's just that they're trying to bring awareness to what is still below the surface. And then furthermore, not all Jamaicans have 10 jobs.
Right, right. And I think that, you know, when you're talking about cultural differences in marriage, there are so many levels to it that you're going to have to communicate in a way that is so loving and understanding. And you're going to have to step back from your culture and realize that the person you're married to was raised a totally different way.
Yeah.
And what God is asking you to do is actually live together and make it work. So, you know, there's a thought out there that says, hey, we need to test drive this whole marriage thing. We need to live together before we get married so that we can iron out all these wrinkles and we can make sure we can actually live together before we come together.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that, number one, there's no commitment on top of that.
Correct.
Right? That actually holds your feet to the fire and says, you have to work this out.
Right.
You don't get to run.
Right.
Right? And then number two, you actually are unable to come together as a cohesive unit in a way that is understanding, in a way that actually works out the problem because you still have a side door that you can walk out of. And so when you come together with another culture, with a spouse that was raised a different way, You have to understand your spouse, not through your culture, but through theirs.
That's good, Mark.
You have to now start saying, okay, how were they raised?
Yeah.
How do they see the world?
Right.
And it's my job to now understand this whole marriage thing through their lens.
And it's important. I think that's great, because if you can understand your spouse through their culture, you won't try to strip them of the things that are also important to them. And it makes me think of Jesus, because when he comes into our lives to love us and to save us, he actually doesn't try to strip us of our culture.
Right.
Which, by the way, is a whole other topic, doesn't have to do with marriage, but that's why people who are saying, if you're going to really follow Christ, you need to be a Jew.
Right.
It's like, actually
God's
not asking me to strip my culture.
You're wrong.
And so, just like I've come to look at how you view the world through your eyes, I've appreciated how you've done the same for me, because the little things that matter to me, a lot of times you'll go along with it because it doesn't hurt anything, but it's important to me. So, for example, for my culture, my roots are in the South.
Right.
And so I don't know about Black Americans who maybe have more of like a West Coast culture, things like that. But here in the South, we have a certain thing that we eat on New Year's Day. Right. You have to have your black eyed peas. I do pintos because I just don't like black eyed peas. But you have to do black eyed peas, collard greens, and cornbread. Right. And they each stand for something. Yeah. And I've started teaching our children that. And I think they get the best of both worlds, because even though you didn't grow up with that, you've never said to me, but Jay, that's so dumb and doesn't make any sense to me that we're just eating whatever we want on New Year's.
Right.
Every New Year's, you allow me to make that meal and you eat it with us. But on the flip side, in Jamaican culture, you getting bun and cheese for Easter.
You're getting bun and cheese.
So our kids get that, and I've never said to you, but Mark, why does it have to be bun? Like, what is it with? It's just a cultural practice. It's a cultural norm. But I think when you refuse to understand your spouse through their culture, you have the tendency of trying to make them your culture, and that's actually not fair to them.
Right, and you are actually rewiring the hardwiring of who they are. Mm-hmm. And that is detrimental to your marriage, because what God is saying is that the two should come together and be one. Yeah. But that one is a mosaic. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful picture of different pieces coming together. It's not a monolithic, uniform, one color type of portrait, but it's a blended family. It's a blended marriage. And one of the worst things to do is to try and strip your spouse of their culture in a way to dismiss it and say it's not important. Exactly. Because you're not getting the best version of your spouse.
That's true. And God put them in their household because that's how he's that intentional that he put them in their that household to be reared by people who are coming from that culture, because he knows based on what he has for them to do, this is the upbringing they need. Right. So for you, a Jamaican upbringing was great. But obviously, God decided for Jen, that might be a little bit much. Yeah. I'm going to put her in an African-American culture so she'll get in just enough, hardline upbringing, but I don't necessarily need her to be Jamaican. And it's not because there's something wrong with being Jamaican, but based on who I'm called to, what he wants me to do, he just decided, but for her, this is the culture I want. And so I think we dismiss what God even wants to do through our spouse when we try to strip them of their culture, because God is that intentional that he makes you the race that he wants you to be and the culture he wants you to be, because it all works together for what he has planned for your life.
Right. And it's a way, when God puts two people together of different cultural backgrounds, it's a way of really stripping your pride. It's a way of really humbling you, because now you're going to have to do life with someone that does life in a different way. Yeah. It's one thing to come together with someone and say, hey, we're going to partner in life and we're going to go down this path. It's another thing to say, man, you want to go left and I want to go right. We have two different philosophies. Yeah. As it relates to walking through life. You handle money this way, I handle money another way. Right. And something as simple as handling money could be the based on your culture.
Right,
Some
that's true.
cultures save more than they spend, just in their mentality. Other cultures, they have pride in different areas where they put their money. They put their money into celebrations. They put their money into family time.
Right.
They put their money into food. They put their money into where they live.
Yeah, and how they dress.
How they dress. Oh, because it's a part of their culture.
Yeah.
Other cultures are like, well, we don't really put our money there. We save our money, right? We're going to invest our money.
Right.
And those things matter because those are the different philosophies that you have to deal with when you're saying, hey, I'm going to partner with this person in life. And then it humbles you. It breaks you down to say, maybe I don't have all the ideas. Maybe I don't have all the right answers for how to do this marriage thing. And I have to lean on somebody else to say, hey, show me how y'all do that with the money. Hey, why do you guys prioritize that? Why do you guys think about it that way? And it actually opens you up to this new window of understanding of how to do life in a blessed way and in a great way and in the way that God wants you to do it. And then when you throw kids into the mix, be careful.
Yeah.
Because your kids can be a problem for your marriage culturally if one person is saying, hey, we're going to raise them how I was raised.
Right.
Instead of saying, we're going to figure out how we can raise them in this blended culture of marriage.
Correct.
Because if I'm saying, hey, we're going to exclusively raise our kids Jamaican, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
And I think it also would say to our kids, mom's culture and Black American culture doesn't matter, which then says their maternal grandparents' culture doesn't matter.
Which then says you don't matter.
Exactly.
If you deny my culture, you're denying me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so it is really, I think, a certain strength and grit and grace that you have to have if you're going to have a successful marriage, well, period. But certainly with someone from a different culture, you have to be willing to learn.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to ask questions and maybe even have tough conversations.
Yeah.
Because like I said, navigating marriage with someone from a different culture is not going to work if the way you're going to navigate it is just through solely making assumptions.
Yeah.
And working off of your own biases. You have to be willing to have a conversation, and you have to be able to be willing to say, oh man, this is what I used to think, but I see that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I see that I'm wrong
there. And a little tip that we've learned that really helps unite two different cultures in marriage is food.
That's true.
If you can embrace your spouse's likes when it comes to food, their culture when it comes to food, it makes everybody around the dinner table happy.
Well, how about our friends who are from like the same culture? And I won't revere their culture because maybe I don't want them to think I'm being funny about them on our YouTube. But they're from the same culture, but one grew up in England, and the husband is always like, I love my wife, but British food is really terrible.
Yeah.
And so...
Yeah.
But you're like, but if you can embrace something from your spouse's food, and that
like cook the things from my culture that I like, even if you don't like them initially, because your growth in that area just causes me to be more endeared to you.
It's true, because I have a family member that married someone in the same race but a different culture, and she said initially, when she got married, I'm not learning to cook that culture's food because I don't like it like that.
Right.
And my mom and her mom were like, that is the wrong response.
The wrong response.
If you're going to agree to marry someone of a different culture, you need to embrace and so the point is, you don't have to love their food.
No.
Because we do all have different palates and different likes. But to say I won't even learn to make the dish because I don't like it, and
right.
You know they like it.
You better embrace it, because you'll be surprised at how, when you start to embrace it more and more, how the love in your marriage just grows. And you realize, number one, it's not that big a deal. Number two, there's aspects of it you probably will learn to like and appreciate. And number three, if that spouse can see how much you're bending to their side, they're going to bend on your side in a different way. It may not be food. They may never say, hey, cook something else. But they're going to open up their heart of love to you in a way that they wouldn't just because they see you giving so much in that area. Cultural differences is such a big thing when it comes, because then you're talking about another level is in-laws and things like that. We're not going to go to certain levels today, but when you're interacting with in-laws that come from a different culture, they're not as soft and understanding as your spouse is. They're going to talk to you in a way, and you're going to go home in the car like, how did your aunt just talk to me like that?
And yeah, especially because if you're coming from, if you and your spouse are both coming from households where your parents and other relatives maybe didn't do a lot of intermarrying,
right, and
kind of stuck with the same culture, it's going to be harder for in-laws to understand, and you have to also navigate that, which is probably a whole other recording. And I think, Mark, only God knows who he has for our kids, but I think our own experience just lends itself to us being more open, so that if God has for our children to marry people that are not coming from American or Jamaican culture, I think the blending of our two households makes them more open to what God wants, but it makes us more open. So hopefully, if our kids end up marrying people that aren't from either one of our cultures, hopefully we won't be the in-laws that drive the other in-laws up the wall.
Yeah, we'll kind of remember what
how
we had
felt
to go through, right? Right.
And not make our kids be like, oh, sorry about my mom. She just Black American, so she don't understand. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be.
I don't want to be that. So this has been good.
Yeah, it's been really good.
So those are a couple things and thoughts around navigating the differences in
So
culture.
let's wrap it up for people. So it's basically asking questions, being willing to have conversations, and being willing to bend and understand and embrace the parts of your spouse's culture that you can.
Right. And being willing to be humbled. Just know that you're going to have to be humbled in some area when you marry someone of a different culture.
Yeah.
So that's what we have for y'all today. This has been Breakfast with Mark and Jen, and we'll catch you next time.